Now, chapter 12, the revolt, the crown is not there, Mahler had to tell Athronges. Athronges ran his fingers through his beard's length with a gesture that said he was near to laughing. Still, everyone knew it was not laughter augmenting the expression. Did you search everywhere? The inner chamber. His voice thundered, and the people trembled. It was as a god standing there with his arms folded before the snapping and the popping of the midnight fire. It threw its sparks into the black night with the smell of oak and pine, and drove flashes of itself up to meld with the stars and become themselves a part of the firmament. Mahler was privileged. Not many had ever seen the campfire of Athronges, the Shepperd Messiah. It is impossible to enter the holy place, replied Mahler. The Holy of Holies is guarded day and night. But I spoke to my uncle, Joazar is his name, who is in line to become high priest. I approached the subject delicately with the ruse that I had concerns about someone stealing the crown. He told me I need not worry, because it is not there, he told me, though an empty pedestal waits for the time when it is found. To Mahler's surprise, Athronges was not angry. Brilliant, really, was his response. To protect the crown by letting everybody believe it is lost. Brilliant. No matter, we will take it during the revolt. There was a sound coming from the blackness beyond the campfire. Mahler's eyes kept wandering toward it. It was a wailing, low, but loud enough to be heard by everyone. Yet they were not looking. They knew better, because Athronges had once more dispensed justice. An execution has been carried out, Athronges volunteered, upon realizing he would not have Mahler's full attention until an explanation was given. He gestured for Mahler to follow him into the blackness and look for himself. So he did, following the big man's footsteps, tripping over stones until his eyes adjusted, and viewed a disgusting sight. The stones were littering the ground in an uncommon way, some stained with blood. One had brain matter stuck to it. A figure was crouched in front of a mound of rocks, a woman. Her frame trembled with her grief, said Athronges, stopping in front of the figure, speaking softly in a kind way. This woman's son was found lying in a sexual way with another man. Beneath the mound were headless remains of two men that had been buried up to their necks. Their bodies would be dug up the following morning and carried to Gehenna to be lost forever. No remembrance, no Shiva, just gone, forgotten, except by the woman crouching. The leftover small chunks of skull and brain matter would be raked into the dirt, lost forever. Explained Athronges, and seeing the revulsion in Mahler's face, it had to be done. The commandments laid down by Moses are absolute. They were given to God. They were given by God to Moses. And they are exactly that, commandments, not suggestions. You cannot pick and choose. You cannot obey one and not the other, simply because one feels good and the other does not. You understand. Athronges was nodding, expecting Mahler to respond with a similar nod, which he did. But the revulsion was still there, the pain at what God expects men to do to other men. The revolt was to take place in Jerusalem, Mahler learned, against the might of Rome, for it is Rome itself that protects Jerusalem. Will you help us recruit from the citizenry? Athronges stated. Athronges never asks, he states. We need more soldiers. Will you help us? Again a statement, not a request. Mahler responded that he would. No other answer was possible. I am in your service, my lord, he said, and suggested that Athronges dress as a common tradesman so that he would not be recognized by the Roman soldiers. Dress plainly, perhaps as a carpenter or a stonemason. Carpenters and masons abound in and around the temple due to its ongoing restorative efforts. Perhaps even sprinkle yourself with stone dust. And so, with Roman soldiers posted in every street corner with the great Messiah cloaked in the guise of a common carpenter, they both silently and without suspicion recruited their soldiers. Some would not believe without seeing the Messiah with rings on his fingers and clothed in fine linens and riding behind fine steeds having halters of silver and gold. But many were willing, even those who had no business in the business of war, old men, women, children, because that is how the Maccabees had done it, their name a cognomen for the phrase, Mi kamocha b'elam Hashim, who is like you, O God? Maccabee, when spoken fast, Mi kamocha b'elam Hashim, Maccabee. The Maccabees brought down the 40,000 soldiers of Antiochus Epiphanes with nothing more than ordinary citizenry. And the Jews celebrated, Athronges explained, said to the people, reminding them of their history. And future generations, in remembering the conflict, would celebrate the celebration, not the victory itself. Because when the Maccabees rededicated the temple with their lights of the Lord, they had oil enough only for one day. Yet their candles burned until a new supply could arrive 8 full days later. That was the miracle to be remembered, not the fact that a handful of untrained Jewish field workers faced off and defeated the empire of the Seleucid kings. Thereafter, the candlestands of the menorah were built with 9 receptacles instead of 7, 8 for each of the 8 days the lamps burned, and a central 9th candle used to light the 8. In like manner, we will take back Jerusalem from the Romans and their puppet king, Athronges told them. With you, we will win, he declared, an army consisting of the people themselves, like the Maccabees, and in the process I will find and wear the crown of King David, heavy with precious stones and a full talent of gold. Athronges was persuasive. He gathered his recruits with remarkable success. The followers truly believed the words of their Messiah, that God would be on their side, as he was on David's side when he fought Goliath, as he was on Joshua's side when the Canaanites were plundered, and that the Romans would be caught off guard, never believing in a million years that the people they were protecting would be the ones to rise up against them. And it almost worked, except that the Romans were wise in the ways of war, more so than the hap-slap soldiers of Athronges, and the Jews were all but annihilated and their temple nearly destroyed. For a time, it had seemed the Jews might prevail. The temple walls were high and sturdy, and the resolve of the Jews strong. They had slings and bows and fired their stones and arrows from the highest points of the walls. The Roman arrows, being fired from below, fell short, or if they did reach their height, they simply hung in the air harmlessly before they returned to earth, or fell upon the flats of the parapets to be gathered up by the Jews and used. But the Romans had capabilities beyond those of the Jews. They secretly brought in one of their catapults, disguising it within the marching throng of a full century of soldiers, and began to launch pots of fire up onto the esplanade. It was the beginning of the end for the Jews. Some of the pots fell upon the esplanade, others landed on the roofs of the open-sided cloisters, and the wood and the pitch and the wax fairly exploded under the barrage. The Jews were unprepared for such a disaster and were thrown into confusion, and the Romans rushed in and struck them down. Worst of all, they seized upon the treasury, where the sacred money was deposited, and where the crown of King David lay, if it was there. It was not. It was by pure chance that Mahler survived, chance and perhaps by skill from his boyhood days and the swordsmanship lessons from the guards. As Macedonians, the guards had fought Romans many times and knew their tactics and strategies, how Roman soldiers bunched together with their shields to make fortresses of themselves like the scales of a reptile, and of how their body armor is constructed to deflect blows, how the only way to inflict any kind of damage at all to a Roman soldier is to come from above or below the breastplate. He found himself on his back beneath one of the cloisters. Its roof was in flames above him. Fire was the enemy now. The heart of the beast seemed directly above, formless, roaring. Almost a thing of beauty, slithering along the center beams with its scales of gold, sending down wave after wave of crushing heat, exploding now and then into glitters of sparks, each in itself a firebrand of stinging pain. Also standing over Mahler was a Roman soldier, arcing high with a spear to drive through his heart. But something happened between these two men, an exchange of the oddest sort. Amongst the chaos, amongst the seconds that passed as if hours, amongst the absolute and utter pandemonium, Mahler looked into the eyes of this complete stranger, and the complete stranger looked into his. A mistaken war to look your enemy in the eye, the temple guards had always said. For then the combatants so often discover that each is not so very different from the other. And, but for an obscure concept called patriotism, they may even come to conclude that it's no affair of theirs, and that all they're trying to do amidst the chaos is stay alive. So it was with this stranger, with the spear in his hand, the stranger that was hardly more than a boy. And so it was with Mahler. The Roman should have done his duty. He should have driven his spear. Instead, he took the time to question why. Why do this, he seemed to have been thinking. I'm not even angry. I don't even want to be here. Because the muscles in his face began to relax, and the flex in his arms and hands eased. And the two enemies made an unspoken agreement with one another, with only their eyes, as if their minds merged, that there was nothing embittering between them. And if one let the other live, it would have no bearing whatsoever on the outcome of this immense and insane conflict born of the human condition. No one would be the wiser. The soldier began to lower his weapon and lost his life. Mahler's Arabian sword. The weapons of the Jews were varied from whatever they could lay their hands on, swords, rocks, pitchforks, found its way up under the breastplate of the young soldier, just as he had been taught by the Macedonians, and into the flesh of his enemy, and up under the rib cage, more by reaction than anything else, almost like it was an accident, something Mahler did not intend to do, though he did intend to do it, though he didn't know why anymore. A moment ago, he was furiously committed to his cause. Now, not so much. As he was pushing the sword into the flesh and vital organs of the stranger, it went easy, far too easy. The Roman soldier's mouth was moving in surprise. We had an agreement, it seemed to be saying, though no words were coming out, only the movement of lips. Mahler began quickly to pull the sword out, hoping it wasn't too late to undo this thing he had done, hoping it wasn't too late for the two of them to do what they had agreed to do in the intensity of their silence, to just walk away unharmed, to let one another live and tell no one about it. The sword thrust was a mistake, Mahler wanted to say. Here, let me undo it. Let me turn time back. The soldier stood stiff and turned and began walking in the opposite direction, then sat down hard, legs out like a toddler sits when he can't quite negotiate the next step. And while sitting, the soldier looked away at seeming nothingness and began to convulse and vomit blood, at which point Mahler scrambled to his feet and fled, fleeing not from fire and sword this time, but from the revulsion of his deed, an act that ran counter to every component and every wheel in the human engine. It occurred to him in that moment that perhaps even the most minimal act of harm is an unnatural force that could stymie and stall the cogs of that engine, and perhaps the cogs of a larger engine to which it belongs. Maybe that's why when someone trips and falls, the instinct is to reach out with assistance. Maybe it wasn't just an anomaly exclusive to Mahler, a weakness of character that caused him to have empathy for his Roman enemy. Maybe it's the nature of the species to protect one another, just as it's the nature of a spider to spin a web, the same web every time, the same symmetry, the same geometry, or of a bird to build a nest, the same nest every time, one being identical to the other, though its makers have never conversed with one another or have never received instructions on how to do it. He heard the crash of a burning beam behind him. He stopped and turned. The beam had exploded into an echo of sparks upon its impact in the exact spot where the soldier had been sitting. It seemed to envelop him in the sparks and the explosion. And another thought came. Maybe he did do the right thing. Maybe the soldier would have taken his life after all, or the life of another Jew, or 3 or 4. Maybe the life of someone he knew. The insanity of it all. The efforts to make sense of something that makes no sense can drive a sane man mad, often does, if one takes the time to think too much about it. Mahler continued to run, and more Jews died, and he became aware again of the ultimate enemy, fire, heat, smoke. It was searing itself into his lungs to make breathing impossible. He felt his legs crumpled beneath him as he struggled to make his chest work. He was not worried about running anymore. He just wanted to make his chest work, and he did somehow in those seconds. He figured out how to do it right before the curtain of black was beginning to envelop him. If he wheezed in the air slowly, bit by bit, then his chest would allow the air to pass. Not much, but enough to keep him conscious, enough to terrify him beyond reason. Soon he was coughing and gasping, gulping in the air by mouthfuls. Still he was unable to move. Still he was lying face down on a smooth paving stone in a street completely deserted. The citizens of Jerusalem had long since gone into hiding, even the animals. Nor were there birds in the sky, nor insects crawling, no life. The temple was behind him, roaring, exploding, rushing, the way fire does when it is massive and uncontrolled. And the smoke was above him, like a low cloud cover. The paving stone on which he lay was so hot he was sure his skin would be seared off, so he had no choice but to lift himself up and to continue running past the silence of the dead bodies, multitudes of them, hideous in the contortions of their last moments. Eventually, the roaring fire came to be nothing more than a menacing sound in the distance. He looked over his shoulder in the same way Lot's wife looked back. The clouds were high that day. The dark plume of smoke had risen to the heights of those clouds and had merged with them to show an eerie sort of marriage between heaven and earth, good and evil. And in their shapes, he saw the image of the young soldier sitting with his feet out like a toddler with his mouth open and forming the words, "We had an agreement." Mahler ran some more, then turned again. He could not help himself. The clouds had drifted and stretched, giving the face and the mouth a sudden, fierce, and vengeful look. The smoke continued to roll into the clouds, slowly, majestically, as if it had a purpose, as if it were stretching the face of the young soldier into laughter to welcome to the fold all those on earth who had killed for a cause. All of the Jews in the revolt died that day. No need to tell Rachel. No need at all for her to know that her husband had been a runaway deserter. His duty had been to return to the camp of Athronges. He did not. He had a greater duty to return to Rachel. He would not ever be returning to Athronges. It was his first taste of war. It would be his last. And Athronges would view it as desertion. Athronges had been seen retreating as well, as a matter of fact, but that was to be expected, demanded. The Messiah is to be protected at all costs. If the Messiah dies, the cause dies. The revolt accomplished nothing. The temple was rebuilt, and the Romans remained, and Archelaus continued on as king. It was because I didn't have the crown, Athronges would tell his people, and he would blame Mahler because Mahler had deserted, and the penalty for desertion in any army is death. Not only did Mahler desert, he failed to find and turned over the crown. Someone told Athronges he thought he saw Mahler carry it off, and the more Athronges thought about it, the more he began to believe it. Mahler had done more than desert. He had turned his back on God's Messiah. A grand heifer was needed for such a sin, the entire animal, one pure and unblemished. Then perhaps Yahweh would forgive. But perhaps not, because a curse had fallen upon the family, even given the sacrifice of the heifer. One day, Eli failed to return from one of his many business trips into Jerusalem. Rachel was constantly pleading with him not to go into the city anymore, at least not for a while, not until the rioting had subsided, until all the would-be kings had given up their notions of wearing diadems on their heads and of being called royalty. But Eli would not hear of it. He went anyway, without guards or escorts. He prided himself on his perfect attendance record with the Sanhedrin and on his punctuality. He would always return on the promised day and the promised hour. Except this day. This day, the promised hour came and went. The day came and went, and another day came and went, then another and another. Then there was the thundering of fists at the door.